Unload the cargo quickly, the tide is turning.
I need 3 more men over here.
These silks must go to the palace immediately.
For centuries, the world has been told a lie, that Africa was always poor, always struggling, and always in need of saving. But what if that narrative was never true? What if Africa was never poor, just robbed? In Africa Was Never Poor, the untold story of a stolen continent. We uncover the hidden history they never taught in school. This is the gripping story of a continent rich in gold, culture, science, and thriving kingdoms, long before colonization began. From the intellectual centers of Timbuktu to the wealth of Mansa Musa, from the ancient trading empires to the skilled craftsmanship and vibrant societies, Africa was flourishing. But over time, its wealth was extracted, its people enslaved, and its image distorted. This documentary doesn't just challenge the myths, it dismantles them. Through powerful visuals, expert voices, and deep historical context, we reveal how Africa's prosperity was systematically stolen and how that theft still shapes the continent's global perception today. If you've ever questioned the mainstream story or wanted to know the truth behind the headlines, this is the story you've been waiting for. Watch now and discover the truth they tried to erase. They told us Africa is poor, but if you zoom out for just a second, the contradiction is staggering. How can a continent that holds over 60% of the world's arable land, 30% of its minerals, and some of the richest oil and gas reserves on the planet be poor? The answer is chilling. Africa isn't poor. It's been robbed repeatedly, systemically, and deliberately. The myth of poverty was crafted, not discovered. This narrative of poverty isn't just inaccurate, it's weaponized. From colonial propaganda to modern-day media headlines, the image of Africa as helpless, unstable, and impoverished has served very specific interests. It justifies exploitation, sanctions economic inequality, and erases the wealth and complexity of entire civilizations. When you control a narrative, you don't need chains. The belief that Africa is poor allows international powers to intervene for its own good, while quietly extracting resources at fire sale prices. The Mali Empire under Mansa Musa wasn't just rich, it was unimaginably wealthy. His pilgrimage to Mecca disrupted entire economies due to the sheer volume of gold he distributed. Ancient Carthage, Kush, Aksum, and Great Zimbabwe were thriving centers of trade, architecture, astronomy, and metallurgy, long before European states even unified. The city of Timbuktu had libraries holding hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and universities attracting scholars from across the Muslim world and beyond. These weren't anomalies. They were reflections of a sophisticated continent rich in culture, knowledge, and commerce. Yet when colonizers arrived, they did more than steal gold and people. They rewrote history. They labeled kingdoms as tribes, destroyed records, and replaced oral histories with Eurocentric narratives. The goal wasn't just to conquer land, it was to conquer identity. And that continues today in subtler but no less dangerous forms. School curricula worldwide still sideline African history unless it's through the lens of slavery or aid. That erasure is part of the theft. Let's talk numbers. Each year, Africa receives around $30 billion in foreign aid, but loses more than $60 billion through illicit financial flows, tax evasion, interest payments, and underpricing of exports. Multinational corporations exploit lax laws to move profits offshore. Meanwhile, African governments are pressured into unfavorable trade agreements and infrastructure deals that benefit external powers far more than local populations. The result? a net drain of wealth from the world's richest continent. And then there's the psychological toll. Imagine being born on a continent your ancestors ruled with wealth and wisdom, only to be told your land is broken, your people backwards, and your future borrowed. That's not just miseducation, it's indoctrination. And it's hard to break free from a system designed to keep you uninformed, divided, and dependent. Foreign aid is often portrayed as generosity, but it's largely interest-driven. Development banks lend money with conditions that shape policy, prioritize foreign contractors, and open markets to multinational giants. Instead of building self-reliance, they build cycles of debt. Africa doesn't need saviors, it needs justice. It needs the world to stop taking, start listening, and start paying back. Africa's wealth isn't potential, it's actual, it's real, and it's here. From Nigeria's oil reserves to the cobalt in Congo that powers smartphones and electric cars, Africa continues to be the engine of the global economy, just without the credit. The continent fuels the digital age, builds the world's infrastructure, and feeds entire nations, yet is painted as a passive recipient of help. That framing must end. Africa isn't poor, it was powerful, it is powerful. And the most dangerous thing about that power isn't its armies or leaders, it's the awakening of its people, a generation rising not with arms, but with knowledge, pride, and clarity. The narrative of poverty is cracking, the real story is re-emerging, and it's one that will change the world. Before Europe ever rose to power, Africa was already shimmering in gold. From the sands of the Sahara to the forests of West Africa, kingdoms built on trade, metallurgy, and wealth thrived for centuries. This was the golden age of Africa, and it tells a story the world has worked hard to forget. In the ancient city of Ghana, not the modern country, but the ancient empire, gold was so abundant it was used in everyday items. The streets buzzed with traders from across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Far from primitive, these societies were sophisticated powerhouses of economics and diplomacy. Then came the Mali Empire, an economic giant of the 13th and 14th centuries. At its peak, it controlled vast trade routes stretching across the Sahara. Its emperor, Mansa Musa, didn't just possess wealth, he embodied it. His 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca is the stuff of legend, with a caravan of 60,000 men, dozens of camels each carrying hundreds of pounds of gold, and a generosity so massive it crashed gold markets in Egypt. His journey wasn't a flex, it was a declaration. Africa was not just part of the world economy, it was funding it. Timbuktu became a center of learning, with scholars, architects, and astronomers drawn to its libraries and mosques. And it wasn't just Mali. The Songhai Empire succeeded Mali and became even larger, spanning modern-day Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. It developed bureaucracies, military command structures, and urban centers that rivaled those of Europe. Askia the Great, one of Songhai's rulers, implemented educational reforms and legal codes while ensuring religious tolerance. The empire maintained its own navy on the Niger River, controlled taxation across its lands, and issued currency. This was African governance at its finest, organized, effective, and rich. To the east, the Kingdom of Aksum, rising in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, was once called one of the four great civilizations of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Aksum controlled Red Sea trade routes, minted coins in gold, silver, and bronze, and maintained diplomatic ties with Byzantium and India. It was also one of the first major empires to adopt Christianity. Aksum's obelisks, still standing today, are feats of engineering that defy modern explanation. These weren't isolated civilizations, they were deeply connected to global networks. Further south, the city of Great Zimbabwe emerged as one of Africa's most stunning architectural achievements. Its massive stone walls, built without mortar, formed a city that housed over 20,000 people. It was a center of trade with goods like Chinese porcelain and Arab coins found in its ruins. The existence of such a city directly challenged European colonial narratives, so much so that early archaeologists suppressed evidence of its African origins, claiming it must have been built by outsiders. This wasn't science, it was sabotage. Trade routes extended across deserts and seas. The Swahili coast, with cities like Kilwa, Sofala, and Mombasa, became hubs of commerce with Persia, India, and China. African merchants navigated dhows across the Indian Ocean, exporting gold, ivory, and spices. They spoke multiple languages, maintained detailed records, and wielded significant political influence. These ports weren't primitive fishing villages, they were global trading capitals. Africa was never disconnected. It was a central node in the pre-colonial world economy. So what happened? The image of Africa as poor wasn't born from reality. It was born from invasion. European colonizers needed to justify conquest. They couldn't admit they were looting advanced, wealthy societies. So they destroyed monuments, burned records, and rewrote history. They replaced empires with tribes and cities with bush. Africa didn't fall, it was interrupted, and the legacy of those golden kingdoms still pulses beneath the surface in the stories passed down, the ruins that remain, and the unbreakable spirit of its people. The scramble for Africa wasn't a land grab, it was a heist. In the late 19th century, European powers gathered in Berlin, carving up the continent like a cake, with zero African voices at the table. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 is remembered as diplomacy, but it was actually organized theft, setting the stage for the most aggressive resource extraction campaign in human history. Within just a few decades, 90% of Africa was under European control. The reason wasn't civilization or Christianity. It was gold, diamonds, rubber, ivory, and land. Colonization was a machine. It wasn't random brutality. It was systematic economic exploitation, engineered for efficiency. Belgium's King Leopold II turned the Congo into his private slave plantation, where millions died harvesting rubber and ivory. Hands were chopped off as punishment. Children were mutilated to enforce labor quotas. This wasn't a side effect, it was the business model, and it generated unimaginable profits for European markets, while Congolese families were annihilated. The British, French, Portuguese, Germans, and Italians weren't far behind. In South Africa, the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley and gold in the Witwatersrand triggered a rush that would change global finance. But it didn't enrich the locals, it entrenched apartheid. Africans were forced into dangerous mines, paid starvation wages, and stripped of their land. The riches fueled European economies, building palaces, railways, and industries off the backs of African labor. Agriculture was also hijacked. In Kenya, fertile land was seized by settlers and turned into export farms. Locals were banned from growing key crops or owning land in their own country. In Nigeria, cocoa and palm oil industries were monopolized under colonial rule, their profits siphoned abroad. Even taxes were weaponized. Colonial regimes taxed Africans in cash, forcing them into labor for foreign companies just to survive. Poverty wasn't natural, it was enforced. The theft went deeper than minerals and crops. Cultural artifacts were looted by the ton. Benin bronzes, Ethiopian manuscripts, Nubian treasures now sitting behind glass in European museums labeled as art instead of stolen property. Languages were suppressed, religions demonized, and names erased. Colonization wasn't just about taking wealth, it was about erasing identity. By the time independence movements began to take hold in the mid-20th century, the damage was incalculable. Economies were restructured to serve foreign markets. Borders were drawn without regard for ethnic or cultural groups, leading to conflict and instability. Colonizers didn't just leave, they left traps, weak institutions, debt, and dependency. And today, many African nations still operate within that same architecture, where the value flows out and the problems stay in. Africa's soil holds unimaginable wealth, but for decades that wealth has come soaked in blood. The very resources that could build empires, fund education, and power innovation have instead bankrolled wars, coups, and corporate greed. Few symbols capture this tragedy better than the diamond. Beautiful, valuable, and deadly. In Sierra Leone, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, diamonds weren't just rocks, they were weapons. Rebel groups seized mines, funded militias, and waged brutal campaigns of terror. These were the infamous blood diamonds. The world watched. Luxury markets in Europe and the US continued to buy. As villagers were massacred and children forced to mine at gunpoint, diamonds flowed into global supply chains with barely a question asked. The Kimberley process, introduced to curb this crisis, became more of a public relations shield than a true safeguard. Even today, diamonds from conflict zones often slip through the cracks, laundered through intermediaries and rebranded as ethical. But diamonds are only part of the story. Oil, Africa's black gold, has been both a blessing and a curse. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea sit atop billions of barrels of petroleum. Yet in these nations, oil wealth has often led to greater poverty, not prosperity. How? Through the resource curse. It's the paradox where countries rich in natural resources suffer from weak institutions, corruption, and slow development because the wealth fuels elite power, not public good. In Nigeria's Niger Delta, oil has destroyed livelihoods. Fishing waters are polluted, farmland is poisoned, and children grow up with toxins in their air and soil. Meanwhile, multinational oil companies rake in billions. Local communities see barely a drop of the profit. Activists like Ken Saro-Wiwa, who dared to speak out, were silenced, executed with the complicity of the state. The message was clear: speak against the oil giants and you vanish. And then there's cobalt. In the Congo, this blue metal powers the future. Smartphones, laptops, electric cars. The global tech revolution runs on African minerals. But much of that cobalt is mined by hand, by children, in unsafe pits. The profits go to companies in Silicon Valley and Shanghai. The labor, suffering, and death stay local. It's 21st century extraction with 19th century ethics. This isn't just about economics. It's about justice. These resources belong to Africa, yet the wealth continues to flow out while the consequences remain behind. The real question isn't why Africa is poor, it's why the world is so rich off Africa's back. The colonizers may have changed their flags, but the game remains the same. Today, exploitation is no longer carried out with gunboats. It's done with contracts, loans, and trade deals. Africa is still one of the richest regions on Earth in terms of resources, but much of its wealth continues to flow outward, not inward. The mechanisms of plunder have evolved, but the outcome hasn't. Africa gets robbed, the West gets rich. Start with trade. Africa exports raw materials, oil, cocoa, copper, cobalt, cotton, while importing finished products made from its own resources at many times the price. It's the same colonial model dressed up in a suit and tie. Global trade policies favor industrialized nations, while penalizing African producers. Tariffs, quotas, and market restrictions make it nearly impossible for African countries to add value and develop competitive industries. Instead of factories, the continent gets extraction sites. Then there's debt. After independence, many African nations were immediately trapped in debt cycles orchestrated by the IMF and World Bank. Loans were tied to structural adjustment programs, which forced governments to cut spending on healthcare, education, and infrastructure in exchange for financing. Public assets were privatized, subsidies removed, and safety nets dismantled. These policies did not foster growth, they crippled it. The continent lost control of its economic destiny as foreign consultants dictated national budgets. Meanwhile, multinational corporations used tax havens and creative accounting to avoid paying taxes on the billions they earn in Africa. Shell companies in the British Virgin Islands transfer pricing tricks that shift profits abroad. As a result, African countries lose more in tax avoidance than they receive in foreign aid. The aid narrative itself is misleading, portraying Africa as a burden when in reality it's a donor to the world economy. Foreign investors often demand investor-state dispute settlement clauses in trade agreements, which allow corporations to sue African governments in secret tribunals for policies that hurt their profits. A country trying to regulate mining pollution or raise local wages can face lawsuits for expropriation. It's a rigged game where corporations have more power than parliaments. And let's not forget land. In recent years, a new wave of land grabs has swept the continent. Foreign governments and hedge funds lease or buy massive tracts of farmland, sometimes millions of acres, pushing out local farmers. These deals are often signed in secret, with little benefit to the communities they displace. Africa isn't being developed, it's being rented out. The post-colonial world was supposed to be about freedom, but economic colonialism is still in full swing. Africa's resources are still powering Western industries, Western lifestyles, Western wealth. Until the systems are dismantled, independence will remain a flag, not a fact. For centuries, Africa was framed as a continent dependent on outside help. But beneath that narrative lies a powerful truth. Africa has always innovated, from ancient iron smelting in Nok to the surgical procedures of ancient Egypt. African ingenuity is nothing new. What is new, though, is the modern resurgence of that innovation and how it's sparking both hope and resistance. Across the continent, a digital and industrial revolution is underway. In Kenya, mobile money systems like M-Pesa transformed how millions access financial services, long before similar systems took hold in the West. In Rwanda, drones deliver medical supplies to rural areas. Nigeria has become a fintech giant in Africa, attracting billions in investment. In Ethiopia, renewable energy projects, including massive hydropower plants, are reshaping infrastructure. These are not isolated incidents, they are part of a tectonic shift. But as Africa builds, outside forces maneuver to control the tools of its progress. Big tech companies are racing to dominate Africa's data, internet infrastructure, and communication networks. Google, Facebook, and China's Huawei are all laying fiber, funding apps, and influencing digital policy. What looks like investment often hides data colonialism, where information flows out, profits flow up, and power flows away from local hands. Even in agriculture, where African farmers have pioneered climate-resistant crops and innovative practices, multinationals push patented GMO seeds and fertilizers, locking farmers into cycles of dependency. It's innovation, but with strings attached. African scientists and engineers aren't lacking ideas. They're often blocked by intellectual property regimes, lack of funding, and global systems designed to suppress local ownership. Africa's rich reserves of critical minerals, like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, are at the heart of the green energy revolution. Electric cars, solar panels, and smartphones all depend on them. And as demand surges, so does the scramble for control. Foreign corporations and governments are rushing to secure supply chains, often without fair agreements or environmental safeguards. If Africa doesn't gain leverage now, it risks repeating history, being the source of the future's wealth but not its beneficiary. Still, resistance is growing. From startups reclaiming tech sovereignty to pan-African movements pushing for innovation hubs, data protection laws, and decentralized systems, the continent's young generation is rewriting the script. They're not just coding apps, they're building futures on their terms. And that terrifies the global powers who have long benefited from Africa's subjugation. The battle isn't just about resources anymore. It's about ideas, ownership, and autonomy. And this time, Africa isn't waiting for permission. It's innovating, asserting, and rising. Africa isn't just the birthplace of humanity. It's the home of its future. With over 70% of its population under 30, Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. Every statistic about population decline in Europe or aging in Asia makes Africa's youth even more powerful. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African. That's not a challenge. It's a $1 trillion opportunity. The world's future workforce, entrepreneurs, inventors, and leaders will speak Swahili, Yoruba, Amharic, and Zulu. But this isn't just a numbers game. It's a story of ambition. Across the continent, young Africans are not waiting for jobs. They're creating them. They're launching startups in fintech, edtech, and agri-tech. They're winning global hackathons, launching clean energy solutions, and using AI to solve local problems. In places where institutions have failed, youth have filled the gaps with resilience, creativity, and hustle. Social media has also become a weapon of truth and visibility. Movements like #EndSARS in Nigeria, #Fees Must Fall in South Africa, and #ShutItAllDown in Namibia show that this generation isn't just building businesses. They're demanding justice. They're politically aware, globally connected, and digitally literate. Their voices are shaking dictatorships and shifting culture, and the world is starting to notice. Venture capital investment in African startups has exploded, growing by hundreds of percent in just a few years. African music, from Afro beats to Amapiano, is dominating global charts. Nollywood and African animation are entering global streaming platforms. This is soft power in motion, shaping how the world sees and hears Africa. But talent alone isn't enough. Africa's youth face unemployment, underfunded education systems, and barriers to global markets. They're swimming upstream in economies designed for extraction, not innovation. The infrastructure is uneven and the policies often outdated. But despite all this, they rise, not with bitterness, but with clarity of purpose. What happens when 1 billion young Africans realize their power, not just as consumers, but as creators, leaders, and owners? The answer isn't just Africa's future, it's the world's future. And it's not a question of if, it's a matter of when. So, can Africa rise again? That question assumes Africa ever truly fell. The reality is Africa was interrupted, derailed, and plundered, but never broken. Beneath centuries of colonial trauma and economic theft lies a living pulse, a civilization in waiting. And now the world stands at a turning point. Africa is not rising because someone is lifting it. It's rising because its people are reclaiming what was always theirs: dignity, wealth, and power. But this won't be a return to the past. It'll be an evolution. Reclaiming the throne doesn't mean repeating history. It means redefining power, not just in terms of borders and armies, but in ideas, economies, and influence. The African Union is slowly finding its voice. Regional trade agreements like AOFCFTA are building new bridges. Pan-African thinkers, entrepreneurs, and artists are stitching together what colonialism tore apart. The diaspora is reconnecting not with nostalgia, but with purpose. Still, rising doesn't come without resistance. The old systems, the ones that profit off African instability, silence, and dependence, aren't going down without a fight. They will continue to extract, distract, and divide. The battleground now is narrative, policy, and ownership. The question is not, will Africa rise? The question is, who will control the rise? Will it be Africans building for Africans, or will it be outsiders repackaging exploitation with new slogans? The road ahead is long. There are real challenges, corruption, infrastructure gaps, climate threats. But the raw materials of greatness are already here. The youngest population on Earth, the richest resource base, the fastest growing cities, and the oldest cultural legacy. Add to that the fire of a generation that sees through the lies, and you have a recipe for revolution, not just politically, but economically, intellectually, spiritually. Africa doesn't need pity. It doesn't need saviors. It needs clarity, unity, and strategy. And above all, it needs its people, at home and abroad, to see the truth, that they are heirs to kingdoms, not victims of history, that they are not just participants in the global economy, they can be leaders of it. The throne isn't in the past, it's ahead, and it's waiting for those bold enough to claim it.